Welcome to Women Who Kick Class, the podcast that dives into the fearless women who changed history and the fights that are still shaping our world today. From suffragists to civil rights activists, these women refuse to back down, breaking barriers and demanding change. And now, here's your host, an advocate, a storyteller, and a woman who kicks class herself, Ann Potenza.
Florence Kelley was an American social and political reformer who coined the phrase wage abolitionism. Her work against sweatshops and for minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, and for children's rights is widely regarded in our society today. Her work helped our country establish federal laws to protect workers, known as the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, which was established over 100 years ago. These laws were finally put in place because back then, many underage children would have to work in factories in terrible conditions and would suffer many injuries, even death. Children could be found working in coal mines. They would suffer respiratory illnesses, lose limbs, even be killed because of how dangerous the factories were. So the Fair Labor Standards Act really helped determine the guidelines for how children should be allowed to work. And Florence Kelley was very instrumental in getting us there. Florence was born in 1859 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and she was pushed into social activism at a very young age, born into a very wealthy family, raised in the Quaker religion, and both her parents were abolitionists and advocates for women's rights. Florence's father had a tremendous influence on her. When she was very young, he would often read books to her. A lot of them had to do with child labor, and she learned a lot of her education from his own personal library. Her father was one of the founders of the Republican Party. He was a judge. He was also a member of the House of Representatives and was a good friend to Abraham Lincoln. He would also frequently appear with Susan B. Anthony and make speeches on women's suffrage and the emancipation of women. And even Florence's great aunt was an influence on her life. She was a school teacher, and she was an abolitionist and leader of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. And her aunt was even in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention when Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were denied access to be delegates at that meeting, which inspired them to come back to the United States and start the Women's Rights Convention. So the good thing is that Florence's parents were very supportive in her education and support of women's rights. When she was 16, she attended Cornell University, was a member of Phi Beta Kappa, and she wrote her thesis paper on disadvantaged children, which was influenced by her father teaching her about underprivileged children. Florence studied history and social science, and she was one of the first women to graduate Cornell University. And when she graduated, she wanted to study law at the University of Pennsylvania, but she was denied entry because she was a woman. So Susan B. Anthony suggested that she should attend the University of Zurich, where she had taken classes on political economy and where they offered PhDs to women. When she was in Zurich, she did meet a Polish-Russian medical student, and they did get married and have 3 children. Florence did begin her degree there, but wound up graduating from Northwestern University in 1895. And after she got her degree, she was then able to start a school for working girls in Pennsylvania. When Florence and her husband moved back to the States, he tried to set up his medical practice, but it wasn't working out too well, and they suffered a lot of hardships. There was a lot of strain on their marriage, and they soon divorced when they came back to the States. Florence wanted the divorce from her husband because of physical abuse and a huge amount of debt, but it was very controversial for her to seek a divorce at that time. So she fled from New York City, where they were living, to Chicago and brought her 3 children. She was eventually granted custody of her 3 children, and she was able to keep her maiden name, Florence Kelley. And when she came to Chicago, she sought out work with the Hull House, which was established by Jane Addams. And with the Hull House, she was able to continue her work investigating child labor. Hull House was one of the settlement houses that were established in this time period, which helped newly arriving immigrants, usually from the European countries that were poor and had no community. And so they would live in this common area, usually poor urban areas, and women like Jane Addams and Florence would bring them together as a community and help them get educated and find work that would help lift these newly arrived immigrant families out of poverty and be part of their new American society. So while Florence was at the Hull House, she worked together with Jane Addams and Julia Lathrop, and they all worked together as labor reformers. And with this, she is credited with starting the social justice feminism movement. By being involved as a labor reformer, this gave Florence the opportunity to go into factories and to inspect the conditions that were there for workers. Florence was a part of so many organizations that had to do with women's rights, child and fair labor practices. She was even a co-founder of the NAACP, and she was well known for asking pointed questions to find a course of action. She studied the federal patterns of distribution of funds for education, and she noticed that the white schools were getting more funds directed to them than the black schools. That fact alone launched her to create the Sterling Discrimination Bill, which was an attack against the Sterling-Towner Bill, which proposed a federal cap of $2.98 for teachers of colored children in comparison to the cap of teachers of white children, which was $10.32. To pressure anti-lynching in Congress, she appealed the National League of Women's Voters to support the Dyer anti-lynching bill in 1922. Unfortunately, she didn't get the support she needed for that action, so instead she wrote letters describing all the lynchings that were happening in the country at that time. And she thought if it gained support from the media, it would make a difference. So she started suggesting to newspaper editors who opposed lynching to start publishing the stories. In 1917, Florence marched in the New York Silent Protest Parade, which opposed the violence of white citizens against black citizens in the East St. Louis, Illinois riots of that same year. So while Florence was working at Hull House and investigating the labor industry, she was selected to be the chief factory inspector for the state of Illinois, and she was the first woman to hold this job. As an inspector, she tried to force sweatshops to follow the rules and treat their employees better. And as a result, she also had to sue several businesses. Florence was committed to finding ways to balance the success of industrialization with the safe and fair labor practices for its workers. So when she was in this position, it gave her an opportunity to report on the smallpox epidemic that was going through the city at the time. She took this opportunity to bring attention to the poor living conditions in the city's tenement houses. And she also used this time to advance the wellness of children. When Florence was young, her father had taken her on some tours of the glass factories at night, and she was able to see for herself the working conditions. So when she was old enough to be a leader in the labor reform, one of the things she really fought for was that children under 14 years old should not be made to work, and that there should be a limit to the hours that children under 16 worked. She really wanted children to have an opportunity to pursue education. And if these kids were working through the night, long hours, there was no way that they were ever going to be able to wake up in the morning and go to school and to learn anything. So that was one of her main focuses, was to let children be children and to earn an education. She really believed that children should be nurtured to be intelligent people. She also investigated the sweating system, which was a practice of work being contracted out to homes of the poor. And since this industry really covered the garment industry, she discovered that there were employees working up to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and even working that many hours, they could still not get themselves enough money to get out of the level of poverty they were living in. One of the jobs that Florence was asked to do was to conduct a survey of the slums of Chicago. And what her survey uncovered was that there were children as young as 3 years old working in overcrowded tenement houses. There were women working past exhaustion. There were children working with with burns on them. There were children and women with pneumonia that were in these overcrowded situations in the slums. And it was just breeding sickness and disparity amongst these unfortunate poor people. So her work discovering this led to Illinois passing legislature that would limit women's work to 8 hours a day and prohibiting the employment of children under 14 years old. And these protective labor laws are credited with being the very start of the progressive era in social reform. One of the organizations she helped form was the National Consumers League. And under her leadership, she developed the White Label Initiative. And what that meant was that white labels were granted to stores and products that met the National Consumer League's regulations, which meant they had a minimum wage, a maximum for working hours, and they provided decent working conditions. So the white label was given to stores that treated their employees fairly, and citizens supported those stores. And the National Consumers League urged consumers to boycott products and businesses that did not meet these industry standards. When Florence was 46 years old, she gave a speech on child labor and women's suffrage at the National Women's Suffrage Association convention in 1906. And this is part of what she said in that speech. Tonight, while we sleep, several thousand little girls will be working in textile mills all the night through in the deafening noise of the spindles and the looms, spinning and weaving cotton and wool, silks and ribbons for us to buy. If the mothers and the teachers in Georgia could vote, would the Georgia legislature have refused at every session for the last 3 years to stop the work in the mills of children under 12 years of age? Would the New Jersey legislature have passed that shameful repeal bill enabling girls of 14 years to work all night if the mothers in New Jersey were enfranchised? Until the mothers in the great industrial states are enfranchised, we shall none of us be able to free our consciences from participation in this great evil. No one in this room tonight can feel free from such participation. The children make our shoes in the shoe factories. They knit our stockings, our knitted underwear in the knitting factories. They spin and weave our cotton underwear in the cotton mills. Children braid straw for our hats. They spin and weave the silk and velvet wherein we trim our hats. They stamp buckles and metal ornaments of all kinds, as well as pins and hat pins. Under the sweating system, tiny children make artificial flowers and neckwear for us to buy. They carry bundles of garments from the factories to the tenements, little beasts of burden, robbed of school life that they may work for us. We do not wish this. We prefer to have our work done by men and women, but we are almost powerless. Not wholly powerless, however, are citizens who enjoy the right of petition. For myself, I shall use this power in every possible way until the right to the ballot is granted, and then I shall continue to use both. For the sake of the children, for the republic in which these children will vote after we are dead, and for the sake of our cause, we should enlist the working men voters with us in this task of freeing the children from toil. So once again, valid reasons why Florence Kelley, one of our suffragists, wanted women to have the right to vote, knowing that through the ballot box, women would stand up for the rights of children. And she gave this speech in 1905. It was still another 15 years before women got that chance to vote. But at least through Florence's work, the work she did through the Hull House as the head of the factory workers in Chicago and bringing awareness to the conditions that the poor, women and children were going through in these working conditions, that laws were passed back then, that labor laws were passed, and that we benefit from today. So now when we see some of our states, primarily Republican-led states, that now are trying to change the laws to almost go back to what it was back then. We cannot be asleep at the wheel as we see this coming through the pipelines. We have to be aware of this, because if you give a little inch, who knows what they're going to do. In the past 3 years, there have been 28 states that have proposed to weaken child labor laws, and 12 states have already enacted them. In Iowa, Republican legislators passed a law in direct violation to child labor laws, allowing 14-year-olds to work in factories and in meat packing plants. If you read Project 2025, there are proposals for children to be able to work in hazardous conditions again. Specifically, it calls on the U.S. Department of Labor to, quote, amend its hazard order regulations to permit teenage workers access to work in regulated jobs with proper training and parental consent. So first of all, please tell me what parents are going to okay their children working in hazardous conditions. And that's just one example of many proposals that are happening right now. And most of them are because of lobbyists pushing lawmakers, because it comes down to one thing: cheap labor. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get cheap labor out of our kids. You think that a kid working a long night in a factory is able to wake up in the morning and go to school and learn anything? No. We're just hurting our kids. Just like not wanting to give poor kids food programs in school. They're not going to be able to learn. Why are we allowing these legislators and these lobbyists to keep hurting our kids? We have to follow in Florence's footsteps and continue to fight against this abuse, because we are the adults in the room. We have to protect the children. Throughout Florence's life, she continued working on labor reform and social reform and women's suffrage. She organized New York's Committee on Congestion of Population, which led to an exhibit on the causes and consequences of congestion in cities and methods for alleviating it, which led to its first National Convention on City Planning in 1909. She worked with others gathering information in order to demonstrate the harmful effects of overtime on women's health. Florence helped lobby Congress to pass the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916, which banned the sale of products from factories that employed children that were 13 and under. And she also lobbied for the Shepherd-Towner Act, which created the nation's first social welfare program to fight against maternal and infant mortality by funding healthcare clinics that specialized in those areas. And in 1912, she formed the Children's Bureau, a federal agency to oversee children's welfare. And another great thing in Florence's life is that she did live until 72 years old, which means she got to see and be a part of the 19th Amendment passing. So she was able to be a woman voter in her lifetime. So as we take a look back on Florence's life, how is her work relevant in our lives today? Well, her work against sweatshops and for minimum wage paved the way for our modern minimum wages of today. And today, discussions about raising the minimum wage and ensuring a living wage continue to be as relevant as workers struggle to afford basic necessities. Her advocacy for the 8-hour workday is still recognized as a landmark achievement. And today, debates about work-life balance and reducing work hours to improve worker well-being continue to echo her vision. Florence's focus on vulnerable workers, including women and children, is still crucial. Our modern efforts to combat discrimination and ensure fair treatment in the workplace are direct descendants of her work. Florence's commitment to social justice and her belief in the interconnectedness of labor rights and civil rights, working with the NAACP, still demonstrates the importance of addressing systemic inequalities and promoting equity for all. Florence's work to end child labor and improve children's well-being had a profound impact on social policy. Today, our efforts to protect children from exploitation and to ensure their access to education and healthcare are a direct reflection of her legacy. And her work with the National Consumers League to promote fair labor practice and consumer protection continues to influence consumer advocacy movements. Her work highlights the importance of businesses being held accountable and ensuring consumers have access to safe and ethically produced goods. And Florence Kelley's lessons on women's rights continue to be relevant today due to her work on labor protections, social justice, and the intersection of gender and economics. Her work highlighted the importance of fair wages, safe working conditions, and an end to child labor, issues that continue to be fought for in various forms today. Florence Kelley's work continues to affect all of us today. If her story inspires you, please share this episode, start your own discussion, find out how you can continue to carry on her work, and I hope that you will join me again next week when I dive into the life story of Mary Church Terrell, another amazing suffragist that affects our world today. I'm Ann Potenza, and until next time, keep kicking glass.
Thanks for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more, contact the show. Visit womenwhokickglass.com. Till next time, keep kicking glass.